So first, thank you, Mark, because you really set the stage very well for me. In particular, I will start with very basic a basic recap about what is a cosmic web and how we understand the birth and growth of this cosmic web. So I didn't know exactly what would be the audience today, so I hope it won't be too basic for you. Then in the second section, because this is an analytics workshop, I thought it would be good to forget a bit about astrophysics and just talk about mathematics for a moment. So I will show you in particular some results about constrained random fields, peak theory and topology. And then I will show you how these ideas can be applied for the cosmic web, and in particular I will focus on what I'm going to call cosmic connectivity. That is to say, how filaments are connected together to form the cosmic web. Okay, so let's start with this very simple introduction. As all of you know, we have this cosmic web, which is basically made of large, almost empty bubbles that we are going to call voids here, that are surrounded by walls, which intersect into filaments, which themselves intersect into the nodes of the cosmic web, where usually big clusters of galaxies reside. So we have this cosmic web, and it is believed to originate from primordial anisotropies in the primordial universe, which are going to grow under the laws of gravity in our expanding universe, and after the gravitational collapse will form this cosmic web that you can see on this plot. Okay, so how do we formalize things? So obviously, I guess all of you know that we usually write down the Vlasov-Poisson system to describe the evolution of the large-scale structure. So basically, we use Liouville theorem in order to describe the fact that the volume of in-phase space is conserved, because we are looking at a self-gravitating collisionless fluid here. And then we have also Poisson equation, because here we want to write down that the gravitational potential is only sourced by fluctuations of densities. So obviously this Vlasov-Poisson system is a complex set of equations. And one way of solving it is to rely on numerical simulation. So if you do so, here is what you see. So indeed, we observe the formation of this cosmic web. So matter escape from the voids toward the filaments, and then flow inside the filaments toward the nodes of this cosmic web. Okay. Just an illustration of the fact that when you see this evolution of the large-scale structure, you also see that the field is becoming more and more non-Gaussian. So we start with Gaussian primordial fluctuation, and then we develop some level of gravitational non-Gaussianities, because voids are becoming bigger and bigger and also emptier and emptier, so they occupy most of the volume. And on the other side, peaks are becoming more and more concentrated. Okay, so now if we look at this Vlasov-Poisson system, maybe we also want to have other tools to understand the physics behind the evolution of the large-scale structure. And therefore, we try to develop some analytical tools to understand what's going on here. And obviously, it's not possible to solve the full problem, but we can rely on these analytical techniques in some specific regimes. So for instance, we can develop a perturbation theory when the level of non-Gaussianity, of nonlinearity, is not too high. And to do so, basically what we do is the following. So first, we take the first two moments of this equation, and then we assume that we restrict ourselves before shell crossing, so that we can close this system of equation by removing this pressure term here, which only arises after shell crossing. So then we have a set of so a closed set of equations that we can solve with perturbation theory techniques. So first we can linearize this system, and then add some higher order corrections and compute those corrections order by order. Okay, but I won't talk about this today. Today, I would like just to illustrate how we understand the formation of this cosmic web, and therefore I will not talk about this Eulerian point of view and how we develop perturbation theory in this Eulerian framework, but I'm going to go to Lagrangian space, as was discussed by Mark in the previous talk. So basically here it's a change of point of view. So just to remind you what this is about. So basically with the Eulerian point of view, you are fixing the frame. So you're looking at constant volumes And you follow, therefore, the evolution of the fields on this grid, so like the density, the velocity field, for instance. So we can compute volume-weighted statistics here. When we go to Lagrangian space, what we do is that instead of having grid, we have particles. So we look at particles, so constant mass, and we look at how those particles evolve. So we follow the fluid. And here we are not interested anymore in fields, but we're looking at basically the displacements of those particles. So we are looking at mass-weighted statistics in this case. And this is a very nice framework in which we can really understand how anisotropic structures form. This is what I would like to show you very briefly here. So basically, even just with the Zeldovich approximation, we can understand the formation of anisotropic structures. So I won't go into the details, but basically, if you write down the equations I showed you previously, and you can get this equation on the displacement, which is called zeta here. So once you linearize this equation, here is what you can get. So at linear order in Lagrangian space, you get this Zeldovich approximation, which is nothing but just ballistic trajectories of the particles. But then it becomes very interesting, because if you take this displacement, this linear displacement, and you compute the resulting density, because of mass conservation, you end up with this equation. And here you can really understand how anisotropic structures are going to form. Because basically you start with an ellipsoid with a given shape, which can be described by three curvatures. So let's say three eigenvalues of what we call the deformation tensor. And depending on the value of these initial eigenvalues, you're going to collapse in these three directions one by one. So first here, you're going to collapse along this direction and form a planar structure, which is often called the Zeldovich pancake. Then you can collapse along the second direction and form a filament, and the third one and form a bound object, a halo, let's say. So with this very simple framework, we can really understand the fact that anisotropic structures are going to form. So it's a first step in understanding the formation of the cosmic web. Obviously, it's not the final word, because what we want to understand is also the fact that this cosmic web is fully connected. So how come we are forming a structure, a fully connected structure, a fully connected web? Okay, let me skip that. So I think the first understanding of this was actually done by Bond, Kaufman, and Pogosian in '96. And basically the idea is that the cosmic web that we see today is already imprinted in the initial condition of the universe. And in particular in the anisotropies, asymmetries of this initial field. So to illustrate this point, basically what they want to show here is that the peaks in the initial conditions are going to form the nodes of the cosmic web to be, and then the shape of those initial peaks are going to form what they call correlation bridges in between the peaks, which are going to form the filaments later on. And this is something you can illustrate with this experiment that they showed in this paper, which is the following. So first you take a given realization of a volume of universe. So here it's so the initial condition of a simulation, if you want. And what is shown here is the isocontours of the density field at a given threshold. So we are going to evolve non-linearly this initial condition. Then on the other side, we are going to duplicate this box and do something which is that instead of keeping all the information, we are going to keep only some part of the information in this box, namely the location of peaks. Actually, not only the location of peaks with the black dots, but also the height of the peaks and the shape of those peaks. So this is the only information you keep from your initial conditions. And then once you have these peaks, so these peak patches, as it is called, you can compute what is the mean field around those peaks. So now you have two different realizations, and the only thing that they share is the fact that they have the same peaks with the same shapes, the same height. And then you can evolve non-linearly those two initial conditions. And basically what you see is that the cosmic web, which is forming in those two cases, is basically the same. So that is to say that the cosmic web that we see today is already imprinted in the peaks of the initial conditions. And when I say peaks, I'm saying the location of the peaks, their height, their shape. So here it's an illustration of the fact that peak theory is going to be very important in this context, and also the theory of constrained random field, which is the topic of this talk today. I would like to mention also, I'm talking about cosmic web. I just want to formalize a bit what I want to say when I say cosmic web. So basically, the picture I have in mind is the following. So it's called the skeleton, and this is what I'm going to talk about during this talk. So basically, what I'm going to call filaments are the field lines that join the peaks of the density field through saddle points, in purple here, following the gradient. So these are gradient lines joining the peaks of the density field. So as you see again, peaks are important. Saddle points also are going to be important. Minima also. So all the critical points are relevant here. In particular, saddle points are important because it's related also to percolation. Okay, so once you have a definition like this, there are plenty of things you can do. You can develop algorithms to extract the cosmic web pattern in simulation and in observation, for instance, and there have been many works along this line. You can also develop a local theory along those filaments, for instance, and actually get analytical prediction for observables like number count of peaks, length of filaments, surface of the sheets, curvature of those filaments, and so on. So this is what I'm going to show you today. And finally, also, I would like to show you on this plot that there is something also which is quite important in this context, which is to understand how much the peaks of this cosmic web are connected to the filaments. So how many filaments connect to the peaks, typically of the cosmic density field. So this is what I'm going to call connectivity, and it will be the topic of the last part of this talk. Okay, so here it's 3, for instance. Okay, so I hope that now you're convinced that peak theory and constrained random field theory are really important in this field. And therefore, I'm going to jump to the second section, which is going to be more of a mathematical section here. Okay, so what is peak theory? So basically, it is the idea that you want to understand the properties of peaks in stochastic processes in random fields. So just a bit of a historical perspective. So I guess the first results were obtained probably in the 40s or so, in particular by Rice, who did a lot of work, at least in 1D. And this was then applied quite a lot when people wanted to understand the communication devices and features in electronic signals. So here you see an illustration where you look at peaks, you look also at excursion above some threshold in the signal, and so on. Then a bit later, in the 50s, 60s, people, and in particular Longe Higgins, started to look at this problem in 2D, and the scientific context was actually to understand ocean surface waves. So they wanted to understand what was the width and shape of the crest, for instance, the distance between those crests, and so on. So all the 2D formalism was developed then, and obviously then cosmology, astrophysics started to be also to use this peak theory, and with works by many people in our field, just to name 2 of them, but obviously there are many more people here. Okay, so how does it work? It's an analytics workshop, so I thought it would be good maybe to show you some analytics. So I hope you won't get bored, but I just wanted to show you some nice results about peak theory, and for that I need a blackboard. So I hope you will all see what I'm going to write. So I just want to sketch what is the idea behind peak theory and how we can actually predict the statistics of peaks in random fields. So how does it work? So you can generate a random field, and then you can, I hope everybody can see, so you can try and detect peaks in this random field. So then you can ask the question, what is the number of peaks I should expect in this volume here with a field with a given, I don't know, power spectrum, for instance, a Gaussian field with a given power spectrum, or any statistics you want. So how can I do that? So first, I need to write down what is a number density of peak. So if I were to write what is the number density of peak at a given position in this map, I can say that it is a sum of Dirac delta function centered on the location of those peaks. So let's say we have n peaks. So I have this sum here. Right? Just a sum of Dirac delta function centered on those locations here. Very, very simple. Okay. So then what I can do, maybe I should give a name to this field. So let's assume that the random field here is called big X, so capital X. So what I can do then is that I can look at the gradient of this field, so grad X, and I can do a Taylor expansion around a peak. So what is the gradient at the position of a peak? Well, it's 0 by definition, right? A peak is a location where the gradient is 0 and the curvature are negative. Then if I continue, you have to take the derivative of this gradient, which is called the Hessian matrix. So let's say Hessian matrix, something like this, times, so at the peak location, times the separation. Okay, so let me call this H maybe for Hessian matrix. Okay, so now I can invert this relation. So this is 0. And if I do so, I can write down the fact that the separation is nothing but the inverse of the Hessian matrix times the gradient. So this seems to be a very simple formula, but it is very important because basically you're going to relate what's going on spatially in your field to something which is only written in terms of field. And as you'll see that this is very important. So now let me go back to this number density of peak. So now I can replace this separation by H minus 1 gradient, and basically it's going to tell me that the number density of peak is nothing but this expression here. Okay, so this is a random variable. I can then compute the mean number density of peak, in my field, and it's going to be the mean of this random variable here, which involves the gradient of the field and the second derivatives of this field. So here, it's a spatial average, and somehow you can use some ergodicity here and relate this spatial average to here something which is an ensemble average, okay, a mean of our realizations. And now we can do calculations, because this is something we can actually compute. So if I write it down, basically it's going to be an integral. So it's just the mean of this random variable, right? And then I have to put a measure of integration, which is going to be the PDF of the field, its gradient, and its Hessian matrix. Okay? So now I can do calculations. So the only thing I need to know is this object here, which I'm going to call the joint PDF. Okay, so the joint PDF of the field, its gradient, and its second derivatives. This is the only object I need. So for instance, if I take a Gaussian random field, this PDF is just a Gaussian, in this case, and I can write it down explicitly. So maybe I can just, okay, let's skip this. Okay, so in the Gaussian case, you can write it down. it's just a Gaussian. And then the only thing you need to know is the covariance matrix. And this is something you can compute, and here is the answer, for instance. So if you know the power spectrum of your Gaussian random field, then you can compute everything here. Which means that then you know exactly this joint PDF. So here you just need to perform an integration and you're done. So with this idea, you can compute exactly the number of peaks, number of minima, number of saddle points. So here, I have only used the fact that the gradient is 0, and that's it. So I have actually considered all critical points. But if I wanted to have only peaks, I could just add a condition here, which would be the fact that the eigenvalues of the Hessian matrix are all negative, for instance. Okay? This would be a condition for peaks, and I could do something very similar for saddle points, minima, whatever I want. So if you do so, actually, you can compute this integral analytically, at least in 2 and 3D. And here is the result. So you can compute exactly what is the expected number of maxima here of saddle point, so in 2D and 3D. So something you can notice, which is going to be important in what follows, is the fact that here, for instance, the number of saddle point is twice the number of peaks. So twice, it's going to be important. And here, well, maybe you don't know how to compute this in your head, but I can tell you that it's almost a factor of 3 between the number of maxima and the number of saddle points. So 2 and 3 is going to be important. Okay, so this is the total number of critical points. You can also compute how many peaks you have of a given height. So in 2D, it's analytical. In 3D, it's not. But you can perform a numerical integration. And here you see the differential number counts of peaks. So here, peaks in 3D, saddle point of filament type here, wall type here, and minima right here as a function of the height of those objects. Okay, so this is a Gaussian prediction. What if we wanted to go to non-Gaussian distributions? So in particular, the Gaussian case applies in the very early, well, in the initial conditions of the universe. But as soon as the field is going to evolve, it's going to develop non-Gaussianities. So how can we account for this? Well, so we can use some perturbation theory techniques. And in particular, we can use an expansion of the PDF around the Gaussian. So it's really like a Taylor expansion, but for distributions here. And we can write it down this way. So here it's just the PDF of the field. What we need is the field, its first and second derivatives. So I won't, well, it's not written down here because it's a bit too long, but basically it will be the same. So the important thing is that you are going to have an expansion around the Gaussian with correction here that involve a cumulance of the field. So for instance, the first correction is going to involve the skewness of your field and then some polynomials. So here, for instance, you have Hermite polynomials because this is the orthogonal polynomial associated with a Gaussian. If you wanted to expand around something else, it would be just different orthogonal polynomials. Okay, so now we can use this kind of expansion, plug that in this equation here, and compute non-Gaussian corrections. So here, for instance, I'm showing you non-Gaussian correction for the number of critical points in 3D. So here, maybe you recognize the Gaussian result I showed you in the previous slide. And here you see the correction. So as you see, the first correction is involve cubic cumulants. So here it's not the skewness because it's not x cubed, but it's some other combination of the field, its first and second derivatives. So for instance, q square is nothing but the gradient square of the field. J1 is a trace of the Hessian, and so on. But anyway, so these are kind of generalized skewness, let's say. So if you know a bit about perturbation theory, you know, for instance, that basically those numbers here, they are going to scale like sigma to the 4, but here it's rescaled, so it's sigma. So basically, it's a correction which is proportional to sigma here. So d of z, if you wish, the gross factor.
This is expansion and first ordering of
Yes. So it's like doing an Edgeworth expansion and you cut at the first order in sigma.
Does this work for very non-Gaussian?
No, for weakly non-Gaussianities. Because actually, so the Gram-Charlie expansion, which is written here, just like the Edgeworth expansion, the convergence is very, very low. So if the non-Gaussianity is a bit too high, then it will never converge. So basically, I would say sigma around like 0.1. This is the kind of order of magnitude we can use here. So just an illustrate. Yes.
I mean, what is the utility of using this expansion? Because all you need to be able to do is calculate those integrals, and if you know the moments, which is what you need to write down the expansion anyway, then you can just calculate these integrals by using the moments.
Yes. So this is what we do.
Right. But why think about it as an expansion if you know the moments, you can do these integrals, and then you're done. But why do you have to think about it as expanding the probability distribution? Because can't you just work with the moments? Is my question, rather than thinking about expanding the probability distribution around the Gaussian.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question because, for instance, if I want to compute the number density of peaks, I really need to write down a PDF here.
But this is just the expectation value of whatever is before.
Yes, but this is very, very nonlinear here. It's not clear. Well, for instance, the boundary, well, the integration, the domain of the integration is going to be a very complicated domain. So it's not clear at all how you can map it straight away to cumulants here. This is really not a straightforward step.
The Gram-Charlie or the Edgeworth expansion are just a way of implementing moments.
Yeah, yes, exactly. That's exactly what we do. Yes. It's just that we want to apply this to peak counts, for instance, and well, how to go from cumulants to peak counts, it's not so easy. It's not an easy step. Okay, so. Yeah.
Sometimes, if you, instead of using the Gram-Charlie, you can take the log of the Gram-Charlie, and that would be like.
Yes, and do an expansion in the exponential. Yes, that's also a way you can do it.
Improve things,
So if you were just to look at the PDF, I think it would improve things because, for instance, now the PDF cannot be negative and this kind of thing. So, well, it's more of a physical behavior. But at the level of peak counts, for instance, I don't think it changes a lot. Because really, we are looking at tiny non-Gaussianities. It's really second-order effect. Okay, so just an illustration. Here you see so number counts, again, peaks, filaments, whorls, and minima in a cosmological simulation. So here you see the amplitude of the fluctuation. So it is small. Again, we are looking at weak non-Gaussianities. So you see the Gaussian prediction with dashed line, and the solid line is including the first non-Gaussian correction from this Gram-Charlie expansion. So you really see how you can capture the first step of the evolution of structure in that case. Okay. I just wanted to mention briefly that we can do one-point statistics of peaks, but also two-point statistics. I won't enter into the details, just an illustration of the clustering of peaks here. We can use exactly the same formalism. So you see the peak-peak correlation function here. So basically on very large scales, this is a domain in which you can do some bias expansion and compute, say, peak bias, for instance, if you, I don't know if Marcello, you talk about peak bias in your talk this week. If we look at small scales, you can see that there is an exclusion zone, which is deeper and deeper when the peaks have more different heights. And so basically what you see here is the fact that two peaks with different height cannot be too close to each other. So, and it's also an illustration of the fact that peaks are not a Poissonian process. Here you see they are really sub-Poissonian and small scales. Okay, so I won't say much more about this issue. I don't think I have more time.
Is that exclusion coming from bias formalism, or is it, does that happen without biases, without some sort of bias prescription used to get the exclusion like that?
So the bias expansion is on very large scales, and with bias expansion, you would never capture the exclusion zone. I think so. So the plot I showed you, it was in a 1D case in this paper with Tobias Balder, and in the 1D case, I think if you wanted to start capturing just the decrease towards the exclusion zone here, you will need to go like to, I don't know, 15th order in the bias expansion or something like that. So it's really something you cannot capture easily with the bias expansion. Okay. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about topology, but I don't know how much time I have left. Not much, I guess. Okay, so maybe I will skip. I just wanted to say that I've talked about peak counts here, but exactly the same formalism can be used to compute the topological characteristic of the field. So I won't enter into the details again, but basically what does it mean to look at the topology of the cosmic web? It means looking at excursion set. So what's going on if you have a threshold in your field and you look at the manifold above this threshold. So you want to characterize the topology of this excursion set. You can use Minkowski functionals, and I'm sorry I won't have time to enter into the details here. So let me skip that. But basically it's all related to peak counts. And you can have predictions for all those Minkowski functionals and also other geometrical estimators. So just an illustration. For instance, for the genus, if you know what that is, let's say the Euler characteristic, the Euler Poincaré characteristic. Basically, you have the same type of integral as what we did for peaks. But here, we don't have absolute values around this determinant, which means that actually we can have analytical solution for this integral and to all order in non-Gaussianities. So here, for instance, you see what is the genus of a field of any non-Gaussianity. Obviously, it's a Serre expansion, and if you want to compute things in practice, you will need to truncate at some order, and it's only possible in the weakly non-Gaussian case. But still, it's quite nice to see that we have this full expansion and this full prediction for the Euler characteristic. And again, an illustration of what we can get. So here you see the genus. I think it's in 3D here, probably. And again, you see the Gaussian prediction with the dashed line, and then the first non-Gaussian correction, which involved a skewness type cumulants. So again, you see how well you can do by going from this Gaussian to this non-Gaussian case. So basically here you see that you're dominated by the Gaussian part. So you see this even Hermite polynomial, which is dominating the signal. If you look at the correction to this Gaussian case, you start to see that we are actually exciting Hermite polynomials of a higher order, and here it's a third order Hermite polynomial, for instance. Okay, so now in the remaining time, I'm going to go to the last section of this talk, which is going to be about cosmic connectivity, so how filaments connect to the nodes of the cosmic web. So it's a really long-term work with Dimitri Pogosyan and Christophe Pichon. I think it took us actually more than 10 years to complete this project, so we were very proud to eventually publish this paper this year. So I'm going to show you what is the understanding we have gained in this 10-year time scale on the connectivity of the cosmic web. Okay, so basically what is the question? We want to know how many filaments connect to nodes. So here, for instance, you have an illustration. You see in red the skeletons, so the filaments of this random field. So basically, if you sit at a node here, you want to know how many branches of filaments are connecting you to your neighbors. So for instance, in this case, it is 4 branches. And you can do it for all the nodes in this field. So in practice, it's not so easy actually to measure. So if you were to generate a random field and you wanted to compute this quantity, it's really not easy to develop numerical tools. This is also why it took us so much time to actually do it. And what we use here is a dispersed skeleton, which is an algorithm designed by Thierry Sousby at IAP to compute this skeleton. And it's really with this algorithm that we were able to actually compute connectivity Okay. So what we did here, for instance, was to generate Gaussian random field realization with different spectral indices. And we computed exactly what is the mean number of connectors of the nodes of this Gaussian random field. So you see that it seems not to depend so much on the spectral index, and it seems to be 4. So the question is, as a theorist, can we explain why this is 4 and not something else? Yes, 5 minutes, okay. So can we predict this number? Actually, we can. So if we think about what is this connectivity, So the first thing you need to know is the fact that if you have a saddle point, so in the middle of a filament here, a saddle point is only connected to 2 peaks. Okay, so one filament will always go through one and one only saddle point. It's a property of Morse theory. So one saddle point is connected to 2 peaks, and one peak is going to be connected to what I'm going to call kappa. So kappa saddle points, kappa being the connectivity. So now, if you take those numbers, you can see very easily that the mean connectivity in your field should be nothing but twice the number of saddle points divided by the number of peaks. And, well, we computed those numbers. So we know how much maxima, how much saddle points we have in a Gaussian random field. So if you remember in 2D, I told you we have twice as many saddle points as peaks, which means that the connectivity is 4, and exactly 4, which is exactly what we measured. Then you can play the same game in 3D, and in 3D, you're going to find this weird number. If you compute it, it's not exactly 6, but it's a bit more. So you see in 2D, it's like a cubic crystal. You have 4 neighbors, so up, down, right, left. In 3D, you would imagine that maybe it's 6, but actually it's not exactly 6. It's 6 plus some defect. There is a 0.11 added to this number. So then, just for, well, out of curiosity, I guess, we wanted to see how this number behaves as a function of the dimension of space. So we did this exercise. Unfortunately, I couldn't come up with an analytical formula for any dimension, so I had to rely on numerical integration. And this was really not easy, I can tell you. But eventually, after a lot of computing time, here is the connectivity you expect in space of dimension between 2 and 11, 12, 13. So basically, it's not a straight line, because it's not exactly this cubic lattice I was talking about. There is some defect, and the defect is actually growing with dimension. So I just try to fit this prediction with some power law, and here is what you find. So it seems to be a cubic lattice plus some defect with 7 to the 4 power law. So if you're interested in this problem, I think something really nice would be to maybe find some asymptotic result. And I failed for now, but probably there is something we could do in the asymptotic case, just for fun. I'm not sure it's really important scientifically, but okay. So this was the global connectivity of the field. But obviously, we can measure the full statistics, right? So here is if you take your field and you measure the full statistics, so the full PDF of the connectivity. Here is the distribution you're going to find. So you see that the tail is quite heavy, right? You can have nodes with 15, even 20 neighbors sometimes. Okay. And then obviously this connectivity also depends on the property of the peak you're looking at. So the higher the peak, the more connected he's going to be with the surrounding, right? So what you can compute is what is the connectivity for peaks of a given height nu. And indeed, you're going to see that the higher the peak, the stronger, the higher the connectivity, and the lower the peak, the lower the connectivity. So if you're a small peak, typically you're in the middle of a filament, so only 2 branches of filament. And if you're big, there are plenty of filaments sticking out. Okay, I just want to mention briefly the fact that obviously this was all for Gaussian random field, but when non-Gaussianity arises, it's going to change the connectivity. So basically, if you take a cosmological density field, you're going to start with 6.1, which is the Gaussian case, and then this connectivity is going to decrease because filaments are going to merge. So across cosmic time, filaments merge and connectivity decrease, and this decrease in connectivity is obviously cosmology dependent. So basically, you can write down actually a perturbation theory to explain this evolution of connectivity, because, well, I showed you Gram-Charlie expansion for peak counts and saddle counts, so we can do exactly the same thing and compute how this non-Gaussianity is going to evolve. And I guess I'm going to stop here. I just wanted to mention that for the sake of galaxy formation, it's really important to understand how much galaxies are connected to filaments which are going to bring some cold gas to feed that galaxies. And in this context, what's important is not really the global connectivity, but it's more about how many filaments are connected locally to this object. So this is what we call multiplicity. And well, I won't have time to enter into the details, but please ask me questions if you wish. So the idea is the following. If you look carefully, locally around a peak, obviously a peak very close to this peak, it's going to have an ellipsoidal shape. So if you look very closely to the peak, very close to the peak, you're going to see that each time there are only two filaments sticking out of these peaks. But then what's happening is that you have bifurcation points. So you're here, then suddenly there is a bifurcation point and the filaments basically split in two. Here there is another one, you split in two, and so on. So you see that locally here, you don't really care about how many filaments you have far away. What you care about is the geometry of these filaments very close to you. So this is what we call multiplicity, and we did a full analysis of this multiplicity also in this paper. So I won't have time to enter into the details, but there are plenty of results on this issue. So we looked, for instance, at how halos are connected depending on their mass. And this is obviously very important in terms of assembly history and the matter accretion on halos at galaxies. We developed also a theoretical framework in order to understand this multiplicity, and obviously I won't have time to enter into the details, but we developed some pretty nice mathematics here, I believe, to describe this fact and actually explain the value of the multiplicity we can observe. And in particular, last thing I wanted to mention is the fact that if you do all these theoretical developments, that I won't have time to show you, I'm sorry, what you can actually show is that if you are a galaxy not too massive, typically there are only two filaments which are going to matter for you. So you're going to be inside a filament with only two branches of filaments. And if you are more massive, usually it's three. So you have three main filaments, dense enough to matter for you. And this is why I think we can explain the fact that it has been shown in simulations that filaments are coplanar around galaxies, and also maybe the fact that if you see observations, what typically you're going to see is a plane of satellites around galaxies. And I think this is a very nice explanations analytically from first principles of this fact. And I'm going to stop here. I'm sorry I've been a bit late. Thank you very much.